pike was a very long spear, and it was a weapon that dominated warfare in Europe for about 150 years, from the late medieval period and right the way through the Renaissance. And of course, being a simple weapon, really being a long spear, inherently the pike wasn't a new weapon. Of course, it had been famously used by people like Alexander the Great, the Macedonians, incredibly important in ancient warfare, and really you could say that the Romans kind of spelt the end of the age of the pike in the classical world. But the question here is, why did the pike make such a massive comeback in the late medieval period in the Renaissance? And why did it disappear again? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we're going to be looking at the pike. Why did the pike have a massive resurgence in the late medieval period and Renaissance? And I think most people realise or think of the pike as something sort of particularly of the 17th century, the so-called pike and shot era. We'll come back to that expression and what it actually means in a second. But in fact, they first started making a resurgence, bearing in mind that of course they'd been very prominent in the ancient world. They first started making a resurgence actually in the 15th century. But it's even more complicated than that. So why did the pike make such a big comeback when it did? And why did it disappear again afterwards? But this video today is sponsored by Raycon. And as we get into spring, it's a great time to be getting outdoors and getting fit. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I use these Raycon bone conducting headphones all the time, keeping an ear out for the kids and also figuring out what these kittens are up to. Now, Raycon's bone conducting headphones are fantastic if you're exercising either at home or in the gym. These headphones use bone conducting technology. You'll notice your ear holes are uncovered there, which honestly, if you're sweating and really hot, is also more pleasant than having big earphones on. It also means if you're in the car with other people and they're watching something else, you can still be listening to your podcast on your earphones and still hear when they talk to you. It also means if you're out and about, whether you're just going for a walk, walking the dog, or maybe out cycling, it gives you better safety and awareness. You can hear the traffic and potential other threats in the street. And whatever type of activity you're doing, they're really secure on the head, which is one of the things I particularly love about them. And the Raycon bone conducting headphones are IP68, water and sweat and dust resistant, so whether you're training outdoors or whether you're just getting really sweaty, they're brilliant. Over 3 million customers are already loving Raycon, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee, there's no risks. You get premium quality without the premium price tag. So the Raycon bone conducting headphones are the perfect way of refreshing your routine this spring. Go to buyraycon.com/ScholaBC, that's my special code, to get a massive 20% off right now. So thanks to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Right, so thanks for sticking with me. Now back to this question. Two fundamental questions. Why did the pike suddenly make a resurgence in the late medieval period and was so popular throughout the Renaissance? And why did it disappear again? So the first very obvious reason why the pike became so popular in the 16th century and end of the 15th century as well, in fact, is, I'm sure lots of you are instantly shouting this at the screen, gunpowder. Now, in fact, gunpowder had been around even in warfare since the 13th century, and certainly by the 14th century we find references to guns being present, for example, at Crécy, but also prominently used during the siege of Harfleur in 1415 and at Agincourt, and obviously used in the 100 Years' War as well. So guns of various sorts, larger artillery pieces and handheld guns, known as handguns, not to be confused with Glocks or whatever, but handheld guns, were already something which were increasingly being used, particularly in certain areas, although generally speaking all over Europe, in the 15th century. And of course these newfangled firearms had some disadvantages, particularly the early ones, but this isn't a firearms video per se. But it's important to note that number one, they were slow to reload, and the people operating firearms were particularly vulnerable while they were doing it. And so just like archers and crossbowmen, they were particularly vulnerable to infantry, close hand-to-hand combat troops, and of course especially to cavalry. Now, cavalry were one of the standard responses to massed archers. We saw this in the 100 Years' War. They specifically basically try to use cavalry to counter archers, because of course infantry can only advance fairly slowly. If you can quickly get cavalry into the archer formation, you can obviously kill some of them, you can disperse them, but also you can interrupt their shooting while your infantry advances. Now, it's very obvious to anyone, I should think, that a really long stick with a spiky bit on the end is a good way of countering cavalry, but it's also useful against other infantry. So in other words, pikemen were particularly well suited to defending people operating firearms. Now, perhaps the nation most famously associated with the early use of the pike are the Swiss, and of course they used pikes extensively, both in their wars against the Holy Roman Empire, but also against the Burgundians. We'll come back to that in a second. And they made extensive use of the pike, but also they were early sort of mainstream adopters of handguns, in other words, arquebuses and early forms of musket. So they were using guns alongside crossbowmen. So if we look at Swiss art of the late 15th century, late 1400s, we see specifically their forces are often made up of people either with pikes or with crossbows and guns mixed together. So they are kind of early adopters and the prototype, as it were, of the pike and shot ethos. And a key moment was the Battle of Seminara in 1495, where a combined French army with heavy cavalry and Swiss pikemen conclusively defeated the Spanish. Now, the Spanish, to their credit, quickly turned this around and adopted pike and shot strategy for themselves as well, into essentially what's a combined arms formation. And the Spanish increased their proportion of pikes to 50%, and then conclusively defeated the French and Swiss at the Battle of Cerignola in southern Italy, essentially, in 1503. And this is a period of rapid adoption of the pike all around Europe, so much so that we see the army of Florence in 1506 has a whopping 70% of its army made of pikemen. Indeed, in the early 1500s, we see that the German Landsknechts have as many as 70% or even 75% of pikes in their armies also. So thanks to the rapid adoption of firearms all over Europe in the late 1400s, end of the 1400s, and the very beginning of the 1500s, so essentially around the year 1500, we see the pike being adopted pretty much as quickly as handguns were being. So we can really say that guns and long sticks go together. But that being said, the pike itself, as mentioned, was not a new weapon. Obviously it had been around in classical times, long before firearms made an appearance, but it wasn't even the first appearance or reappearance of the pike in the Middle Ages. Many of you will know about the Battle of the Golden Spurs, in which the Flemish absolutely defeated the cream of French chivalry, heavy cavalry, in 1302, and they were predominantly armed with pikes. Yes, they also had golden dags and various other things, but pikes were a major part of their armaments. And this, of course, was a good way of defeating cavalry. So even before the widespread adoption of firearms, pikes were already a really good way of particularly militias and relatively low-class soldiers, a way of them balancing the power balance when the main opponent is using heavy cavalry. Indeed, some of you will already have thought about that famous scene from the movie Braveheart. Yes, for all of its other historical inaccuracies, that's one thing they sort of get right, the fact that they used schiltrons. I won't necessarily say, like in Braveheart, they were just chopped down saplings, but they were essentially an early form of pike-ish, long spear pike. So admittedly, the schiltrons, which weren't only used by the Scots, but also by the Northern Welsh. In fact, the Southern Welsh were famous for longbows, but the Northern Welsh were famous for long spears. They were known as spearmen. And these were, of course, in the late 1200s. So Edward I, in his wars in Wales, but also his wars in Scotland, had encountered these schiltrons. And you could absolutely regard these as a very similar solution to the problem. You're talking about primarily an infantry force that don't have a lot of cavalry, or indeed a lot of other equipment. They're not particularly wealthy, but they can get pikes and hold at bay a large cavalry force. So Scotland, Wales, Flanders, we see a pattern emerging of these sort of citizen armies or kind of militias, we could call them, raised, given pikes and able to hold their own against far more resourced and economically advantaged armies. And this is also, of course, what the Swiss were doing. So even leaving firearms out of it for a second, it's fair to point out that whether it's the Swiss, who don't have as much armour or cavalry or equipment as necessarily the people they were fighting against from the Holy Roman Empire, or indeed the Burgundians later on, or indeed we're talking about the Scots, who were relatively poor compared to the English at the time, or the Northern Welsh, same kind of situation, we can see that the pike is a kind of leveller. It is a way of raising a large number of men, in many cases who don't have much armour, and that's also important as well, because if you are using a very long pike, you are keeping your enemies, whether they be cavalry or other infantry, at a long distance. You could argue that being well equipped in terms of armour is less important for the pikeman than it is for something like a halberdier or someone using a sword and shield. So the fact is that pikes go hand in hand with these sometimes slightly economically disadvantaged or even impoverished armies fighting against these very wealthy medieval armies who have all the armour and all the cavalry. But ironically, the Swiss made large use of crossbows, famous from William Tell of course, and firearms. So if you have a force which has lots of pikes, not very much armour, but you have a bunch of guns and you have a bunch of crossbows, yet again the armour is even less important, because the armour of your opponents is not able to stop the guns. Okay, so there is some armour which is bulletproof, admittedly, but the majority of armour is going to be far more vulnerable to your guns than it would have been to, for example, longbow arrows. Crossbows can give a slightly higher rate of fire than the guns can, so they're very good for wounding horses or wounding lesser armoured people. But the fact that you've got guns in conjunction with your pikes makes you not only defensively very strong, but also offensively very potent, even against armoured foes. And of course, while the Swiss were early adopters of this in the late 1400s, by the end of the 1400s, loads of nations all over Europe were copying this way of fighting, and even their enemies, the Burgundians, who they defeated incidentally, the Burgundians even adopted 1/8 from 1471, so quite early, from 1471, they adopted 1/8 of their army as pikemen. Right, so looking at the last 2 points, so the fact that firearms are very important, and also the fact that this is a weapon that's very useful for people who maybe don't have as much money or equipment or heavy cavalry, there was another thing emerging at this time, and that is armoured cavalry. Now, obviously, armoured knights had existed for a long, long time, but what we see at the end of the 1400s and especially in the 1500s is the increasing use of horse armour. This, of course, made them far less vulnerable to archery, both longbows and crossbows. However, they're still vulnerable to guns. So if you are facing a very rich army, let's say like the French army, for example, or the Holy Roman Empire, who can field a large force of heavy, barded, very well armoured cavalry, then potentially pikes are a really important way, for not very much money, of holding them at bay. Now, of course, you can't necessarily stab through the armour of the horse or the rider with a pike, but what you can do is you can prevent them breaking your formation. If you have a large block of pikes, you can keep the horses at bay and keep them away. What happens during that time? Your people with arquebuses and later on muskets are shooting them. So the pike has a very important part to play, not just in poking people with the pointy end, but at keeping horses away, first of all from your gunners, but also away from you. And it doesn't really matter how well armoured those horsemen are. If they can't reach you with your lances, but you can push them away with your pikes, and remember, it's not just one person with a pike, it's an entire block of overlapping ranks all pushing those horses away. If you're able to do that and shoot into them at the same time, that's a very effective way of dealing with this very potent and dangerous fully armoured cavalry which was around at the time. Now, these are all good tactical reasons to have pikemen and have pike blocks in your army, and a good explanation of why they suddenly reappeared at this time. But there's another way of looking at it as well. Society was changing, countries and economies and banking and all sorts of other things were changing at the time. And what we do find is that the nature of the raising and managing and funding and keeping in the field of armies in the 16th century seems to become a little bit more modern. Fundamentally, we're into the early modern world. And it is clear that pike blocks require a certain amount of training and coordination to be effective. Firstly, this isn't a medieval rabble of people with an assortment of hand weapons. They have all got the same weapon. In many cases, they've got the same armour. In many cases, their equipment and all of their armour and weapons were actually kept in state arsenals or even local armouries. We even have some of them still surviving in places like Graz in Austria. So if they're being centrally provided for, centrally equipped, centrally organised, and the amount of administration behind this, they're also being, to some degree, centrally trained. And that's what you need for pikemen, because the pike is not a haphazard weapon. It's not a weapon that can be wiggled around and used instinctively. The pikeman must act as a coordinated, trained block. And so for that reason, we see in the 16th and 17th century, we start to see pike drill. So just the same as in the 19th century, we've got cutlass drill and bayonet drill and marching and all of this kind of stuff. In the 16th century, we start to see the increasing kind of modern view of training soldiers that we're more familiar with now. And that's what you need for pike blocks to work. That's what Alexander the Great, that's what they had in the ancient world. And indeed, the Renaissance saw the rebirth, exactly as the name, as it says on the tin, the Renaissance, the rebirth of that idea. So the professionalization. Now, in most cases, these weren't standing armies, so to speak, but they did go through pike drill, and pike drill is an important element to pike blocks working, and the pike being an important weapon. So it's part of a sociological, economical and technological, in some cases, change and development that was happening in the 16th century particularly. You really can't have people wiggling around pikes and being attacked on the flank. You've got to have them knowing how to maneuver the pike, to change front and represent the pikes down in a new direction. You've got to do it in a coordinated fashion, which requires training more akin to what we're used to in the modern world. It wasn't really until the end of the 15th century we'll really start to see the systems in place to enable the coordinated training, preparation and deployment of pike blocks. Now, another reason why pikes were particularly successful from the end of the 15th century through the 16th and well into the 17th century is because let's think back to the ancient period. So one of the things that the Romans did to overcome pike blocks was to use large shields, the Roman scooter like this here, and using a large shield meant that you could close in on a pike formation because it covered enough of your body that you could literally just walk into the pikes, pushing them aside, pushing them over the top. So this is I would almost call this shield an anti-pike block shield. It's an incredibly important invention, but in addition to that, the Romans actually had really good armour as well. People often overlook, I think, the importance of the armour. Now, whether it's Lorica Hamata or Segmentat or whatever, they were, generally speaking, well armoured, and they were well armoured across their legions because they were well centrally funded and equipped and, of course, trained, and they had good helmets. So the combination of this type of very large shield, obviously they come in different shapes and sizes, but generally speaking, the Roman shield is a large one, covering most of your body all the way down to your knees, at least sometimes your shins, and used in conjunction with good armour and helmets, and the fact that they're using a short sword, means that you can close in with a pike block. Now, this wasn't really a thing in the age of the Renaissance pike, because of course pavises existed, and pavises had been quite important in the 15th century, but as soon as gunpowder started being used more often, number one, shields are far less important because the bullet's going to go straight through the shield, but in addition, the armour is less important. So what we start to see is fewer people using large shields, fewer people using all-encompassing armour as we go into the 16th century, which just goes to make the pike even more potent, because if people are using fewer shields and lighter armour, now the pike is an even more effective weapon. And on that note, I don't want you to think that the pike is simply a defensive weapon. They absolutely were used defensively. Obviously, Alexander the Great, and in the ancient world, phalanxes and pike blocks were used offensively. They could be used, and schiltrons were used by the Scots offensively as well. So they could be used to attack. However, generally speaking, it's not always the case, but generally speaking, in the age of gunpowder, what is your most effective attacking weapon? It's the gunpowder weapons, whether it's the field artillery or whether it's the people with handguns of various sorts, arquebuses and muskets. They are the way of inflicting the greatest casualties on the enemy, which means that in that context, actually, I would argue the pike is primarily defensive in order to protect your people operating guns, essentially, because although you can move forward and attack with the pike, number one, you don't want to go too far away from your people with arquebuses because they're not going to be defended therefore, and the cavalry can sweep in. But in addition to that, you poking at people with your pike is not going to cause an enormous number of casualties compared to what those guys reloading and shooting can do. So fundamentally, the firearms are the most important offensive arm now, and really the pikes in a combined arms action, their most important role is to work in conjunction with those firearms and make sure that the firearms don't get taken out. So we've seen why the pike rose to popularity, a combination of features. Obviously firearms and the growing importance of firearms played a very important part, but also it was deeper than that. It was also to do with getting soldiers onto the battlefield, but it was also connected to social changes essentially and economic changes that meant that you could actually train a bunch of people with pikes and they were a useful type of soldier to have alongside the guns and everything else. But why did the pike diminish in importance as we go, in fact, through the 16th and 17th centuries and eventually virtually disappear from the battlefield? So there are sort of two answers to this question, but the first part is more focused on why did pikes diminish in importance on the battlefield, and essentially it's down to the advancement and growing prevalence of firearms. So ironically, one of the main reasons why pikes became so important on the battlefield was the exact same reason in the end why they gradually started to disappear. Firstly, pikemen were incredibly vulnerable to firearms. So the pikemen themselves, especially if they weren't particularly armoured, it was true in some cases, not all, but they themselves, because they were a tightly packed block, were very vulnerable to bullets. Now, one of the things, I've talked about this in a recent video actually, about arrows and crossbow bolts, is they have a trajectory like this, okay, which means that if you shoot short, it lands in front of the enemy. If you shoot long, it lands behind the enemy. But musket and arquebus balls travel in a straighter line. They have a flatter trajectory, and that means that tightly packed bodies of troops, you're more likely to hit them. Number one, you're more likely to hit the front of them, but secondly, if you go a little bit high, you're more likely to hit someone behind, or a little bit low, you're more likely to hit someone in the legs rather than just hitting the ground. But in addition, because of the power of the projectile, it can go through the first rank and potentially into the second rank. In some cases, maybe even more than that. So first of all, the musketeers, so people using muskets and arquebuses, are more dangerous to the pike block. Then we have to bring artillery into the mix. So artillery can obviously shoot a ball which will bounce through ranks of infantry. I'm smiling, but it's not nice at all, it's horrible. So the pike block is also more vulnerable to the artillery as well, and obviously if we're dealing with any type of explosives to that also. So fundamentally, pike blocks are more vulnerable to gunpowder weapons, firstly. Secondly, as we go through the 16th and 17th centuries, the effectiveness of those firearms and the number of those firearms increasing makes the pikes even more vulnerable. Because firstly, if you have a higher rate of fire, for example, so in the 17th century, we see the gradual adoption of the flintlock replacing matchlocks. But in addition, just generally speaking, the training, the reliability, the accuracy, the range, in some cases the power of the firearms being used, as that improves, as the firearm technology improves, and in the number of field artillery, for example, and the accuracy of and range of the field artillery, makes the pike block even more vulnerable than it already was. And then, of course, if you're in the administration putting together armies, as the firearms become more available, more economic to produce, and you have factories making firearms in greater numbers, you now have to choose, okay, we've got, let's say, 10,000 men, and of those 10,000, how many do we want to have as pikes? How many do we want to have as arquebusiers or musketeers? And at a certain point in the 16th century, there starts to be more and more and more people with firearms, and therefore fewer and fewer with pikes, because you can only field a certain number of men, you can only equip a certain number of men. So the ratio between pikes and firearms starts to tilt from being very, at the beginning of the 16th century, beginning of the 1500s, being very predominantly, you know, as much as 70 or 75% pikes. Gradually that percentage comes down and down and down, so much so that the Spanish tercios, for example, the very famous Spanish formation using pike and shot, they were usually split approximately 1/3. So usually 1/3 pike, 1/3 muskets, and they had 1/3 swordsman, or sword and shield usually, sword and rotella essentially. So they were split third, 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 but in some forces we find very commonly 50%, 50%, and gradually as we go through the 16th century, the percentage of pikes goes below 50% and the percentage of firearms, so arquebuses and muskets, just two different types of handgun essentially, increase. So much so that by the year 1600 we find that usually, not everywhere and not all the time, but usually the number of firearms is usually higher than the percentage of pikes. So for example, in the Spanish military, and we could look at other militaries in more detail maybe at a certain point, but if we just look at the Spanish as an example, they went from 33% guns, 33% pikes, 33% swords, and that gradually shifted so that by 1632 in Spain, we've got around 68% of people with firearms and 32% with pikes. So it had completely flipped around. So we've got more and more people with guns, fewer and fewer people with hand-to-hand combat weapons. So there was already a gradual shift for having fewer pikes, more firearms, but then something really groundbreaking happened, which really spelled the beginning of the end for the pike. And that was the bayonet. Not exactly like this, but we'll get to that in a second. So around the 1670s, there start to be early experiments or early adoption of the plug bayonet. Now, initially, a plug bayonet is obviously it's a knife. In fact, the word bayonet stems from the place Bayonne in France. However, it seems that initially a bayonet was just a type of knife, but at a certain point in around the 1670s, we start to find a type of knife, now known as a plug bayonet, which you can stuff in the muzzle of your gun. Now, obviously, when that starts to happen, you can now have everybody with a musket or arquebus and everybody with a plug bayonet. And you can all, when you're attacked by, for example, cavalry, pull out your plug bayonets, quickly ram them in the end of your musket, and you can all act as pikemen. So now you don't have to divide your force between pikemen and musketeers, you can just have everybody as musketeers. Now, an obvious disadvantage of the plug bayonet is that while you have the plug bayonet in your muzzle, you can't load and fire your gun. And in fact, various people came a cropper of this, including the English fighting the Scots during the Jacobite uprising. But really early on, as early as the 1690s and around 1690, we start to see the early developments of what's called the socket bayonet, sometimes referred to in period sources as the zigzag bayonet. Zigzag. And this, of course, has the advantage of, obviously, you've got your pointy end on the end of the musket, but your muzzle is clear, so you can continue to pull out your ramrod, you know, load, ram, prime, and fire, as you would do with a musket which didn't have a bayonet in the end. So this has the inherent advantages of both, and you really don't need pikemen anymore at this point. And so you really, already by about the year 1700, it was very, very rapid adoption. We've gone from plug bayonets to socket bayonets. By around the year 1700, really, pikes, they still existed, and in some places they were still used. For example, boarding pikes were still used on ships, and sometimes things like NCOs or sergeants carried forms of pike, or sometimes halberd or spontoon. Got a spontoon behind me here. There we go. But for the most part, your standard line infantry didn't have pikes anymore in most places. Most major, well-funded and developed armies now immediately switched to musket with a zigzag socket bayonet on the end. Plug bayonets were still retained in some places where they hadn't yet switched to the socket bayonet. But by and large, this spelt the end of the pike. So the 18th century was really dominated, and most of the 19th century as well, was dominated by the musket with the bayonet on the end, as most viewers of this would know. So really what spelt the end of the pike were these two main things. First of all, the improvements and reliability and range and power and everything else of the firearms available, and the numbers of them available, which meant that it became more and more important to have more and more firepower and fewer pikes. And by that point, pikes had really become almost entirely defensive to protect the musketeers. But then the final death knell of that really was the adoption of the bayonet. So there we go. That's obviously a whistle-stop tour summary of the rise and fall of the pike in the Renaissance era. Now, some of these points could definitely sustain further deeper dive videos. Some of these aspects I've skirted over quite quickly because I have to cover quite a lot of ground here. We've looked especially at the Swiss and the Spanish, tiny bit at the French, but the experience of the pike and the preference of the pike was higher or lower in different places. An interesting point to note is that the English army, under the Elizabethan period, for example, and the Henry VIII all the way through to Elizabeth I, in that era, it's quite clear that pikes were not quite as popular in England in the 16th century as they were on the continent. We retained greater use of halberds and bills for some reason that's not entirely clear. Equally, it's clear that the Spanish, for example, the tercios, they used these sword and shield guys, which was somewhat unusual. Most people didn't do that, whereas the Landsknecht early on had used about 10% of their troops had two-handed swords. That's also quite unusual. So not everybody did it the same way, but it's very clear that from the Swiss pikemen of the late 1400s, well, from about 1470, 1480 onwards, the Swiss pioneered the use of the pike, and it spread very rapidly and was adopted pretty much in all places, but not always to the same degree. But it does seem that it died out mostly due to the same reasons. It died out fundamentally because firepower became more and more good, better, but also became more and more important. And then finally, the bayonet solved the problem, and within 10 years, pikes had pretty much disappeared in mainstream use. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be with my musket and my bayonet. I'll continue to be Matt Easton, and I will see you back on the channel really soon. Please make sure you're subscribed. Give me a like. It really helps the channel. It's not much, it doesn't cost you anything, but it really helps me. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you really soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.